Well, hello, everyone. As Kirby mentioned, my name is Sarai Martinez. I'm the Environmental Justice Policy Advisor at OXY. We're going to be talking about environmental justice policy, the tools, and how they're implemented in Colorado. I'll allow the panel to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Courtney Taylor. I'm a principal with Ramboll in our Fort Collins, Colorado office. My background by technical training is I'm an atmospheric chemist. I cut my teeth doing ambient air monitoring in the Front Range, and I was working on environmental justice before I really knew that it was environmental justice for about the past 10 to 15 years, working on federal projects, trying to respond to community and public comments, making technical information approachable and understandable for the public and decision makers. At the same time, it was really interesting and challenging how to bridge and optimize project design features in a way that minimize environmental impacts, address community needs, and also created economic opportunities. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Phyllis Resnick. I'm with an institute called the Colorado Future Center, which is affiliated with CSU. We're a very small institute, so I get to make up all my own titles. So I'm both the executive director and the lead economist of this institute. I'm probably a little bit of the oddball on this panel because we don't specifically focus on energy, but we focus on community health in kind of in all aspects of community health. So I will be sharing with you some work that we've done that can complement environmental justice efforts around the state. And my academic background is, as I said, in economics. So I've also spent a lot of time looking at the intersection between macro fiscal and budgetary issues in community health as well. So a lot of the conversation yesterday around the tax implications of certain policies, of course, piqued my interest. So thank you for inviting me to be here with you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Awesome, thank you. My name is Christy Woodward, and I am the president and CEO of a company that I started just a couple of weeks ago called Astute Regulatory Solutions. But I've spent the last 6 years and will continue to work for the Colorado Oil and Gas Association doing regulatory affairs. So I've been doing that for 6 years. I actually just finished my 33rd rulemaking in that time. And so I'm an environmental engineer by training, but have been doing a lot of policy, all things ECMC air, you name it. So happy to be here and want to thank Kirby and everyone for hosting such a wonderful event. Definitely.
Well, perfect. Just a little, I guess I didn't say much about me, but I'm actually a land negotiator for the last 13 years and took on this role for OXY. So before I get started with the panel, I'd like to just provide some context. And just by show of hands, does anyone know what environmental justice is? Okay. That's a good number. Well, I'm going to give you a definition, and I'm going to read it here so I don't stumble over it. So environmental justice is making sure that all people, regardless of the color of their skin or their economic status, are treated fairly and have meaningful engagement when decisions are made about their environment, and that no community be disproportionately impacted by environmental burdens. So those that don't know, hopefully you know now, and I think it's helpful context to be provided for the rest of the discussion. So I have a slide here. I'm going to summarize kind of what's been going on in Colorado. There's been a lot of movement on environmental justice here in Colorado. So the first slide here, we have Environmental Justice Act. That was came into effect a few years ago. And that did a lot, but what I really want to focus on is the Environmental Justice Action Task Force. And that was made up of, I believe, approximately 20 individuals from various backgrounds. Industry was part of that task force. And they came up with recommendations on how to move environmental justice forward. The next point here is Environmental Justice Task Force, again, made several recommendations. One of them was to update the definition of disproportionately impacted communities through House Bill 1233. And that ties into EnviroScreen, which Courtney will touch on. And that's, I believe most of us know, is an environmental justice tool that is used. I know OXY uses it for looking at communities close to locations that we may permit. And I have a point here of rulemakings, which Christy will touch on here. And really, there are rulemakings now that are incorporating environmental justice. And the last bullet here is kind of a joke. It's what will Colorado legislature do? And really, I feel like the agencies are getting tugged back and forth and trying to adapt. And you have industry in real time trying to permit wells. So it makes for an interesting dynamic. And I do think environmental justice will continue to grow in our state and certainly impact industry. Will it impact local governments? Maybe. But that's so. Courtney, I'm going to move on to you. I mentioned EnviroScreen. Can you please give us an update or overview?
Absolutely, and I think there's some earlier discussion about Colorado EnviroScreen. So this is an environmental justice screening tool that was commissioned by the State of Colorado Environmental Justice Unit. Colorado State University, the Department of Environmental and Radiological Health, was the tool developer. They built the tool, they really modeled it after a similar state tool, the California EnviroScreen tool. And I think that this provides an overview of kind of what the user interface looks like. Let me advance the slide. Show me the big green button. So the tool developers ingest 35 different parameters or types of data into the tool. They have grouped and categorized these indicators using different categories. The first that I would like to draw your attention to is the demographic information. So this really is the type of information that's necessary to help define the definition of a disproportionately impacted community consistently with how Colorado defines that. And you can use the Colorado EnviroScreen tool to identify those communities that meet that definition based on the data. There's also environmental data, as you would expect and appreciate, to understand the existing burdens and how they change across the state spatially. In addition, there are health outcome information. There's climate risk information and proximity information. And you can see those all in the lower part of that kind of hierarchy. What I think is relevant and important for us all to understand is that that information is aggregated in different ways throughout the process, and you can get and obtain that information for any location in Colorado, but it's all rolled up to that single number at the top. And that single number essentially becomes a range from the lowest value to the highest value in the state of Colorado, and that becomes a spectrum. And communities that have impacts that are 80th percentile or higher are then classified as cumulatively impacted communities. And then if you go back, you can use the user interface to zoom into any area of interest in order to identify and understand the types of data that contribute to those numbers and how to define that community.
Great, thank you. Christy, so we have EnviroScreen as a tool, and you have experience navigating the assessment of disproportionately impacted communities in the context of developing regulations. What limiting factors have you seen in the terms of data available, and how does that affect a company's ability to navigate regulations?
Yeah, I appreciate that. The EJ Act was passed in July of 2021. It was an off session that year because of the pandemic. And we were just starting a rulemaking that would take place, you heard earlier, every December. We spend Christmas at CDPHE together. And we were quickly pivoted to all of the control measures and things that we were going to do to protect air quality in that rulemaking, to have additional dispensation for environmental justice communities. And that was all based on the first version of the EnviroScreen tool. So we have things like increased frequency for leak detection and repair, almost twice as frequent if you're in a disproportionately impacted community. We have to escalate how quickly and where and prioritize where we sample and test and monitor what we call enclosed combustion devices, which is how the emissions off of a tank get controlled and reduced. There are dispensation for prioritizing pigging operations and control of those for midstream facilities. That's cleaning out a pipe and it comes out in a community and they want those controlled first. And that's just a few of a number of additional requirements. We're currently headed into a rulemaking in May where we're going to be looking at enhanced modeling and monitoring. We actually did one last May, and the legislature at that time had just changed the definition of a disproportionately impacted community, but they had not, the governor had not signed that bill yet. So there was a lot of really creative thought amongst the air quality control commissioners about how to account for a definition that had just changed right before the rulemaking that was not yet a rule, but knowing that you were making a rule on something that was undefined. And then you had to adjust the EnviroScreen data and information to account for that different definition. And so it was a huge challenge. And I understand, and we'll be testifying later at the legislature, that there's a strike below on another bill that proposes to change that definition yet again. And so each time that happens, we look at the census block groups and the data that goes into EnviroScreen, and the boundary of where that location may be moves and changes. If you're an oil and gas operator and you're trying to figure out where you're supposed to be doing leak detection and repair twice as often, or you were supposed to have prioritized testing by October 31st of last year, and the boundary moved, and maybe you weren't in a disproportionately impacted community, or now maybe you are, we're trying to figure out how to chase that, how to show historical compliance, how to show that you're meeting the rules with a boundary that moves. And so that's incredibly difficult, as you can imagine. Particularly, if you have one facility or two facilities, it might not seem like that big of a deal, but many of our members at COGA have 100, 1,000 facilities. And so even if that boundary changes just 1 or 2%, you're going to assess 100 to 1,000 facilities. And then you're going to have inspectors come out and ask you, were you compliant with this in October 31st of 2022? And what was the definition at that time? And what's the definition at this time? And how does that roll into a rule? So it's an interesting time, but a great case study of how those changes affect what we do on the ground every day and how we comply or try to comply with the rules.
Thank you, Christy, for that. Phyllis, so my understanding is that you helped create a tool called CODI. Can you elaborate on that and tell us how it should be used in the context of development, service provision, and philanthropic opportunities in Colorado?
Sure. Well, thank you. And I think Christy's comment about the definitions constantly changing is part of the impetus for why we were commissioned to develop CODI. CODI stands for Colorado Disproportionately Impacted Indicator. It's very creative. And we were commissioned by the Colorado Energy Foundation to take kind of a broader look at challenges facing communities so that there would be some more context around a notion of disproportionate impact that wasn't so heavily focused on just environmental and health, which is what we see in EnviroScreen. And then I also put up here this screenshot from an application from our colleagues at the Colorado Fiscal Institute, very focused on climate impacts around the state. And so I specifically called this slide complementary applications, because I think that the more you can sort of develop a mosaic when you're trying to understand community impacts and not use just any one tool to say this is the be-all and end-all, that we get better understanding and policy out of all of that. So our process was to work with the Energy Foundation and a task force that represented the sectors that you see above. I'm not going to read them all to you. They're pretty straightforward. To really understand all the stressors that are being placed on community, and then perhaps in how we could build a tool that could also allow service providers in these sectors to use our tool to better target their programs and outreach. And so the idea was to build a tool that was broader than just sort of health and the environment and incorporate also economics and other components of stress in the community. And with that, we came up with essentially 12 dimensions that are populated with 3 to 5 variables each. When I used to teach statistics, if I got to a slide like this, everyone went running out of the room. So I have no math and no variable detail here, except to tell you that if I can entice you to sign up, and I'll give you the sign up at the end, for the site, you'll see data that populates how communities are either thriving or struggling with outcomes in any one of these 12 dimensions. At this point, I would normally go to a long demo, which also makes people run for the door. And so I decided not to do that, and instead try and get you curious with what is a fully hypothetical. I'm not intending to suggest that this is going to become policy in the state, but what if we were to decide to say, you can no longer burn wood as a source of home heating fuel? This graphic is completely nonsensical, and if someone turned this into me in a class, I'd fail them because it has no definition along the horizontal axis. But what I've mapped here for you is a series of dots that really end up looking like a line, but each dot is a census tract in the state, and it's measuring to what extent households in that census tract are reliant upon wood as a home heating fuel. And the 5 that I have circled at the top are sort of outliers as very heavily reliant on wood as a heating fuel. So the question is, if we were to say, again, completely hypothetically, you can no longer do that, what kind of impacts might face those communities? And so you could go to Cody, and this is sort of my trying to hook you into the site, and you can see how those different communities score on our indicator of essentially community stress. In this map, as an economist and a former accountant, I almost never use red. But we used red on purpose because we wanted those tracts that jump out to say, you know, these are the tracts that are really facing community challenges. And then the bluer tracts are the sort of less impacted. And then in between, it goes red, orange, kind of beige, light blue, dark blue. So you see a few tracts here that are outlined. Those are those 5 that were in that graphic that I said I would fail my students for. And so if you were working on a policy to understand the impact there, you could see that that tract that's circled in red, I believe it's somewhere around Alamosa or somewhere in the San Luis Valley, is the most reliant, and also is a tract that is obviously facing other community challenges. So what we like about this tool is it lets you drill down and understand all the stresses that are on a community and how a policy that would require, in a sense, this hypothetical transition might put other stresses on households. Do they have the economic capacity to manage that kind of transition? How else might it impact those communities? So with that, hopefully I've given you enough to be enticed to go to, and hopefully we can provide this website to the website that's listed above to access Cody to sign up for an account and start using it in sort of better understanding the communities where you live or you're working and how those might be impacted by policy or where there are other community stressors that maybe need some additional support. So to your question now about, you know, what sectors could benefit, I spent lots of years working in local government. I could see when I was working in local government, it would help me understand kind of what's happening on the ground in the different communities in the town where I worked. I think I've already mentioned nonprofit providers who can use this to better understand how to tailor services. We've used it with a housing authority to understand that a lot of their housing authority properties were in food deserts. And while they were providing housing, the folks who then were being supported with housing couldn't access healthy food. And then obviously to hopefully provide more context around these questions of environmental justice as well. So thank you for letting me take you through that quickly. I'm happy, you know, later or, you know, over lunch to answer more questions or, you know, get you the site for access.
All right, thanks, Phyllis. So I feel like we've talked a lot about kind of more theory concepts. So how do we put this into practice? For instance, looking at outreach and engagement, how do we take classic outreach and engagement and use these tools to engage with marginalized communities?
Want me to start?
Sure.
I'll start. You know, we get asked a lot what the oil and gas industry knows about environmental justice, and I would wager we know a lot about environmental justice because we live and work in the communities where we operate. And we also do a tremendous amount of philanthropy. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I think from 2017 to 2021, we donated something like $17.6 million to philanthropic efforts across the state, hundreds of thousands of man-hours in food banks, you know, schools, you name it. And so I think we work very closely with those communities. We also work very closely with the nonprofits who serve those communities, and I think that that's really, really important. And I think if you're looking to develop in a new area, and this would apply for any emerging or sustainable technology as well, if you're looking to develop in an area or a new community, it would behoove you to go in and look at the EnviroScreen tool, understand what some of the stressors are on that community, understand the new regulatory requirements that are going to apply. You can go into the Cody indicator and understand that that community might need access to a grocery store. They might need better access to transportation or childcare. And you, as a company, can engage with that community to give them what they need and hear them and make sure that they feel seen and heard. So I think that's one example that I would give for how it can be used.
And I think I'd like to build on that. That's a great example that collectively, there are folks in this room have been doing outreach for decades, right? Whether it's your citizens, your community, your constituents, if you're an elected official. And I think environmental justice too, I mean, this is first initiated in '94 with an executive order. So it's recently that we've had this renewed focus. And what I like to ask myself is, how are we doing and how can we do better? I mean, these are just fundamental tenets of any business or local government operation. How are we doing and how can we do better? And that can really set the stage for defining what is it that you want to do, right? And what are those measures of success? So we really kind of akin it to like a classic baselining, like where are we now and how can we improve? When I think about outreach and how that's changed more recently, we think a lot and put a lot more emphasis on two-way engagement methods and the meaningful engagement. You started with that definition of what is environmental justice and the meaningful engagement part. Classically, as a society, we've defaulted much more frequently to one-way communication methods. Texting, voicemails, emails, those are all, like flyers, those are all one-way communication opportunities where you don't get to have a dialogue or discussion with those affected parties. And so taking those types of classic outreach, kind of throwing them out the window and thinking more constructively, how can we truly engage in a dialogue? And that is where you then go to that meaningful engagement part. You're not truly having meaningful engagement unless you're taking that input and feedback back and changing what you're doing in response to the input you've received. So you really need to make sure that you're addressing and incorporating those marginalized communities that haven't typically been included in the decision-making process, mapping out where are those questions that people can influence and affect the outcomes, getting them engaged early on. I think we typically feel more comfortable when we already know what we're doing. We feel an obligation to notify people. But if we're notifying them of what we're doing, we've missed those meaningful engagement opportunities along the way to collect feedback when the decision's being made. And then the last piece I would just say is documenting and tracking that input that you've received to demonstrate what information's been collected and how have you responded to that.
Do you want to add anything to that, Phyllis?
I guess the peril of going last is everyone has already said what you're going to say. But I will add one thing. Having worked in communities actually all over the world, largely in the developing world, you're going to be seen as a more sympathetic partner in this engagement if you understand kind of what the people are walking in already feeling. So we felt very strongly when we built Cody that it could also serve as sort of a support for engagement, because if I'm going to walk into a community and I already know that they're a food desert, or I already know that there's stress in the school system, or that the transportation system's crumbling, I can be more sympathetic and then be seen as more of a partner in that engagement. So we were hopeful that the work we do, and we do quite a bit of work around healthy communities, helps to educate folks so that when you are working in community, you have a better understanding of what the people living in that community are struggling with. They're always going to know their struggles more than you will, but if you at least know a little bit, it can help you in that conversation to sort of be sympathetic to what they're struggling with.
I love that. I mean, this is kind of more organic, but the understanding and coming to the community authentically, really trying to understand where they're at. And I think in my discussions with clients and other parties who are really trying to get communities and citizens at the table, one of the biggest challenges they're having is how to open up space for them to come forward, right? How do you even begin the process of connecting and involving people who might not even have the bandwidth, right? Like the childcare, we all feel very resource limited, and then there are extra burdens to participation to be aware of.
Well, thank you for that. How can local governments and industry use EJ considerations for planning and siting?
Want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay,
Go
go first.
Go ahead, Christy.
I think that understanding that EnviroScreen is a screen, it is a tool that you can look at to assess the environmental burdens on a community. I think if you then look at the CODI indicator and understand what some of those other determinants of health may be, or those other stressors on a community, it just helps you to determine how to best to engage, what may be needed. Maybe you don't, work in that area. There's a lot of conversation right now around the concept of disproportionately impacted community and the concept of a cumulatively impacted community, which Courtney alluded to earlier, which is this 80th percentile of environmental burden. And there was a lot of conversation at the Environmental Justice Action Task Force, which was a tremendous effort that I think led to a tremendous success, about making sure that there are additional considerations for those cumulatively impacted communities. It's baked into CDPHE's Reg 7, it's baked into Reg 3. They look at enhanced modeling and monitoring. But it's also important that you understand if your project is proximate to people, and I think that gets overlooked a lot, right? For example, 48.8% of the state is a disproportionately impacted community, most of that in rural areas on the western slope. Where you're not proximate to anyone, you're simply considered disproportionately impacted because of your financial situation or for some other one of the 34 determinants. So I don't know if I quite got to the answer of the question, but I think it's hugely important to use that as a first step to assessing where you're going to be, what the potential impacts are to communities and people near you, and how you can best engage if that is an issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, so we work closely. I think I've told Christy, our mantra is data, data, data. Like somebody had a great slide, data, data, data. I was like, oh,
we're
I need
geeking
that
out
slide.
now, you guys. We're getting there.
But so I think starting with the tools is an excellent starting place. Really, when you're doing siting, how can you not leverage spatial information in order to help your routing process, right? And I think it's really just that conscious, focused effort of making sure to include the information such as CODI or EnviroScreen, both to understand and incorporate environmental justice, the demographic considerations as part of those siting criteria in order to essentially de-risk your projects, right? Like we classically include environmental and existing assets and where your tie-ins are, but including explicit consideration of those communities and communities that may already be facing significant burdens. I think somebody I was chatting with earlier was talking about how we used to try to co-locate all of our industry in the same place. And so we're now changing our mindset. So how do we essentially disaggregate our infrastructure to kind of normalize impacts consistently? And that becomes an incredibly complex process that obviously I think you need a lot of data and information to help understand where are the risks, and then using that as a tool for going to the communities and talking with them about their concerns should there be something in that. And then we go back to baseline. How can you look at your project to make sure that you're not disproportionately impacting certain communities as part of your project, right? Are you exclusively mapping in a DI community, or is that balanced? Is that consistent with the baseline of how many communities are in that corridor, for example? And I think, local governments have been doing planning processes. That's the core tenet of what they're doing with their land use designs. And so I think that they've probably already been incorporating a lot of these considerations. And I think we would just go back to those questions of how are we doing and how can we be doing better when we're in our planning process.
Right. The one thing I would add is we use this sort of umbrella term, local government, but when you really start to disentangle that, local government means lots of things, right? It can mean a municipal government, it can mean the county, it can mean a school district, it can mean a special district like a fire district. And so we tend to have people who are very expert in what they do, but hopefully, tools like the CODI tool or EnviroScreen, I think probably more with CODI because we specifically brought in school district data and transportation data and health data, which is typically county, and then other data that's more the purview of cities, that it maybe starts to help break down those silos and realizing that when you're the resident in these communities, you just see it as a system that's supposed to support you. So like taking a more broad view and a more integrated view of what is local government and how they can all together kind of recognize the challenges and some of the EJ issues from many perspectives that may not be their sole focus, I think is important as well.
Well, I appreciate the dialogue here, and I promised Kirby 5 minutes of Q&A, so let's...
I think we still have time before we get to Q&A.
Oh.
We're good. I think we have time for one more.
Are we good, Kirby? Where is he at? Yeah. Okay.
I think we have time.
All right, well, let me ask you all one more question. How do the needs and requirements of communities change depending if you live in an urban or rural area?
Yeah, how do the needs of the community change? Yeah, I think, again, if 50% of the state is considered a disproportionately impacted community, and a lot of that is rural areas in Garfield, Moffat, Routt County, you see areas like Craig that are going through a just transition, and understanding that they're maybe in DIC partly because they're located near mining and heavy industry, but also partly because they're losing their jobs, right? And so how do you take that into consideration versus, a site up on the Rhone Plateau that now has additional requirements for twice monthly LDAR and everything else when they aren't near a single person. And so it's really important, I think, that proximity piece and understanding the cumulative of the burden, but then again, also some of those social determinants of what a community may require.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point about how the socioeconomics of the communities can really be dependent on the local industry there, and they don't have, in the rural communities, you do not have the same access to that. We talked about energy diversification earlier, right? And in those urban areas, you have a much more diverse base of where you can seek employment opportunities. And so in rural communities, there's potentially a lot more internal struggle, right? Of like, what do I need money? Do I need clean environment? And can we as an industry help to support so that it's not an either or, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that really can help to lessen the stressors, right? Mm-hmm. Because then they can focus more on those economic stressors rather than the environmental stressors. I have more thoughts on the urban stuff, but
yeah. I was thinking the same thing about the urban, because we tend to say urban or rural, but those are very big categories. Within both of those, there are sort of sub-classifications of community, which is, I think, the reason why when all of us build these sites, we build them at the smallest geography we can that we can get, reasonable data for. So even within, let's take an urban area, you can have sort of like very core urban and then a little more exurban type development, and the stressors there are going to be different as well. So, using anything that's sort of geospatial to do this kind of analysis helps you better understand, even within those broad categories, what's happening in community.
And I love how you just talked about that, and doing things in as small a space or footprint as you can. And I think that's really at the crux of what Christy was talking about earlier too, where the 40% of our state is classified as DI, and that really is a linkage to this urban versus rural. I'm sorry, it's not versus, urban or rural definition, and this, but essentially, the resolution that we have to work with in our tools is based on the U.S. Census data, which all of that data is aggregated up based on 3,000 roughly people or so in a geographic area. So when you think about our rural areas, that's a much larger land area, and that's how you get our census block groups being whole counties in the West, right? And so I think there's this fundamental challenge with that is federally, that we're not really talking about or recognizing that it has a very different characteristic and solutions and essentially data needs for our urban areas versus our rural areas, and that fundamentally we need finer resolution information to make informed decisions about where are the people, where are our resources, because when we're talking about a whole county as being a single area, that's just not accurate, right? You really can't address true root problems if you're looking at it that way. And so we're trying to figure out how to use other types of data sources to help supplement this fundamental problem. And I guess my concern is that we're not looking at this nationally, and we're not really assessing this nationally, and that has ramifications for Colorado.
Perfect. Do we have time for questions, Q&A? I believe we do.
Hi, Tessa Sorensen, Energy Liaison for CDPHE. Many people know me, of course, and where I sit with EJ. I'm curious as the panel's opinions on the best direction for operators to go. You talked about siting for EJ concerns, but what about operational design?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a tremendous amount of operational constraints as well that are baked into the regulations. And I mentioned sort of these compliance issues right now, right? As this definition of DIC changes every time the legislature gets together in May, we struggle because the boundaries move. And if I have, again, 1,000 well facilities and 500 of them are in a DIC, and I have to do twice monthly LDAR, escalate my enclosed combustion device testing, pay into a fund for community monitoring that's not near the community I'm working in, do enhanced modeling, have a tremendous amount of racked analysis, et cetera. Promised I wasn't going to use alphabet soup, but I just did it. I just did it. Then how do you comply with that moving target? And as an agency, I think for CDPHE, a question might be too, what's your inspector going to say when they come out and you've had 3 years of data with 3 different definitions and boundaries of a DIC, and you did something once a month the first year because you weren't in a DIC, twice a month the second year because you were, and then back to once a month the third year. How do we track that? How do we make sense of that? But there are definitely operational considerations for CICs versus DICs. Okay, we gotta go. I'm done. Oh, sorry, guys.
I must have missed. Okay.
With that, let's have a hand for our panel. Thank you so much.